Buongiorno, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for making the time for coming to this secret session, which was not published until a few hours ago. In fact, I have to ask, how did you guys find out? Like, how many of you found out by Twitter? It's I'm the little booklet. Fantastic, all right. Great. Fantastic, great. So anyway, I'm glad that you're here. Thank you for choosing this session rather than another. I hope I will not disappoint, which I probably will. My name is Vittorio Bertocci, and I am a program manager on Windows Azure Active Directory, where I take care of our developer surface. That means libraries, APIs, all these kind of things. So that's what we are going to talk about today. I'm going to show you how to build a Windows 8 application which authenticates against Active Directory. And it's harder for me to say Active Directory because for more than 1 year, I've always said Windows Azure Active Directory in this context. Because until 2 days ago, Windows Azure Active Directory was the only component in our offering capable of doing OAuth, which is really difficult for me to pronounce. So I hope that you'll write the driver and learn about it. I'm doing my best, but I know it doesn't sound very American to you guys. And in fact, now that you know a bit more about me, let me ask you something about you, if I manage to see with all these slides. How many of you guys have Visual Studio installed on your primary machine? All right, very good. So, for the ones who don't have it, what's your excuse? No, I'm joking. Like, this is just a way for telling that this is a session about development for developers and for applications. And I know that Active Directory tends to attract administrators and IT pros, and I love them. My life would not be possible without them. However, this session is not for them. So if you are an administrator, and unless you really, really, really like heavy Italian accent, I strongly recommend that you take advantage of one of the exits and that you take a better use of the money that you spent. If you stay, please don't write in the comments, oh, this was for developers, because it is totally, completely, absolutely by design. Do we have a deal? Excellent. Thank you. Perfect. All right. So what are we going to talk about? Here is how we are going to spend our hour. First, I'm going to make a bit of positioning. Like, why do we even have a session about the topic? Isn't it that I just write an application, I double-click on it, and ta-da, my identity goes everywhere? Not really, which is why we have to think a bit about the problem. It is very likely that I will bore you with some theory at that part. However, I cannot skip it. I agonized about, should I show the theory, should I skip it? However, since I assume that some of you develop also for a non-Windows platform, how many of you develop for non-Windows platforms? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, some. Excellent. So the idea is that here, behind the scenes, we use protocols that are pretty much standard. So you can reproduce any of the things that I will show in any platform. However, we have libraries which do what our developers like to call magic. Let's say that they add various levels of abstractions so that you just describe your problem and we solve it for you without really exposing you to how we do it. However, if you want to reproduce those results elsewhere, you kind of must know what happens behind the scenes. At the same time, when something goes wrong, you really want to know how it works, because if you want to troubleshoot, you must know what's going on under the hood. Of course, nothing ever goes wrong, right? Then we are going to go into the details of developing a solution. So I'm going to show you a bit of code. And with a bit of code, I mean really just very little, because we did our libraries so that there's very little code that you actually have to write. And then I'm going to discuss how you can take the same approach and use Windows Server Active Directory. I'll do it all the time because 1 year is a long time. So you have to unlearn this thing. And you'll see that the good news is nothing changes from the application perspective. You use exactly the same code. You just take it and point it to the local directory instead of using the Windows Azure directory, and everything works. And you get some interesting features that you don't have with the cloud. And then I'll wrap it up. All right. So let's start. So let's see what is the problem with applications today. So let's just say that, of course, we always start with the user. Here, you have your user. And let's say that your user lives in some kind of identity store, be it a directory, be it whatever it is that you use on your premises. And let's say that the user owns a resource, which I have yet to learn how to pronounce. Resource. Resource. How do you pronounce it? Sounds good. Fantastic. Thank you. Those are little tricks I use for having the chance of drinking my coffee. And normally, like the classic application in here, like the resource would be a document, it would be certain rows in a table of a database, or the ability of calling a service, of obtaining certain information, like whatever the business of your company determines. And typically, if you'd be like in the classic intranet Kerberos Nirvana, you'd have your local application, which could be written in whatever language as long as you can double-click on it and it calls. And this application can somehow reach out to this remote resource, and the identity of the user will magically go with it, magically. It will go with a Kerberos ticket, which will carry the relevant information, and the resource, just for the fact that it exists on the network, it will be already primed to understand this identity information that comes with it. And in fact, that's pretty much how it worked, how it still works for on-premises. However, here, as we move, and now like it's already 2013, can you believe it? Still no flying cars. But we don't have flying cars, but we have a clearly new way of doing IT. And like, what is the 5-letter word that our marketing is like delighted to always push with you guys? Come on. 5-letter words? The cloud. 5. The cloud. So I like to, how to say, pull the leg of our marketing guys, but the reality is that they are right. The cloud brings an enormous competitive advantage, and even if today you are not considering it, eventually competitive pressure from your competitors will somewhat force you, because it's so cheap, it's so fast. And how many of you guys are already using Windows Azure? All right, excellent. Thank you. As a shareholder, I am delighted. And how many of you use a cloud that is non-Microsoft? All right, very good as well. It's important to jump on the trend. So what happens when you run on the cloud? Well, it happens that if you take your resource, which is the typical thing that you do as a first step, and you deploy it in the cloud, now your resource is beyond the reach of your domain controller. And if you ever followed any of the presentations that we did about Windows Azure Active Directory and WebSSO, it's kind of the same thing. Like the fact that the client now is a rich client, a native app, anything that is a non-browser doesn't change the matter. Before you had Kerberos, and now this thing lives outside. And unless you wanted to get like your space elevator and do the VPN, which can be done, however, like it's not a very convenient way of dealing with that. And without counting the fact that if you are an ISV selling the access to this resource to others, of course, you cannot count on VPNs. It gets better because now you can do things like moving also your directory in the cloud. And then, of course, here, not only there is the problem of the access, but there is also the problem of the info about your users and how this resource would be able to retrieve them. But here, especially relevant to this talk, there is this new tendency. Often, this application will run on a device which might not be capable of joining your domain. As a result, even if you are in the Kerberos Nirvana, this won't work anyway. Let's say that this thing cannot access the domain. So unless you do a browser, doing a rich client is going to give you a problem. There is another problem, which is you don't own that device very often. Like the user owns this device, they like the latest, and like I am a living proof of that. This device I bought with my own money. My wife also works in IT, so she's very forgiving for this kind of stuff. Because it's the latest Lenovo Helix. I saw it and I lusted on it, and I said, yes, I want it. And so I went on eBay and I hit with my own credit card and I bought it. Now, in this case, it's a device that can join and is joined to the domain. However, I could have done it with any other device. So it is a tendency which clearly happens everywhere. How many of you use your own device at work? Look at this. And you guys are IT guys, so it's especially relevant. So what happens is pretty much the same thing that happens for a web-based application. We have to raise the level of abstraction. Before, we were able of relying on the infrastructure. Now we have to somehow move things at the application level, or at least move toward the application level. And a way to do that is to use one open protocol, which has been especially successful in this area. And anybody is brave enough to tell me what that protocol would be? OAuth. You guys do pronounce it correctly. OAuth, correct. We can rely on OAuth. OAuth is finally, after a very painful, very long 33 drafts, a RFC standard. So it is ratified by a standard organization. It is a protocol, and I will not go too much into the details, which has been devised for enabling delegation between entities. And specifically, like the basic scenario was, I have a website which has pictures. I have a website that can print pictures, and I wanted to delegate, give my delegation to the printing website to access my pictures on the pictures website without ever disclosing my picture website passwords to the printing website. So that was the genesis. However, it worked so well that it started being used for securing any kind of APIs, regardless of where the client lives. In the scenario that I just described, the client is a website. So a client which runs on the server, often source of confusion. But client in this case is a role that you play. However, with some modifications, like the classic devices, you can't trust them to protect a secret, for example, so you have to change a bit of the protocol, but you can apply the same principle on devices. And that's what's happening across the industry. Everybody is doing that. And of course, we don't want it to be left behind, and we do it as well. And it really isn't an authentication protocol, but that's a rant that I don't want to bore you about it. This is a pet peeve of mine. And also, one thing that instead I have to warn you against, OAuth is not like a sign-in protocol, like, for example, the classic SAML, WS Federation, or OpenID 2.0 or OpenID Connect, in which if you know that A and B support that protocol, you know that they can talk to each other. OAuth is, let's say, a bit under-specified. Let's say that it leaves big blanks, saying like these left to the reader to implement and figure out how to do it, and everybody will fill those blanks in different ways. As a result, knowing that A and B both support OAuth does not guarantee that the two will talk to each other. Just so I give you the right expectations. So later I will show you a library which is capable of obtaining tokens using OAuth. You will not be able to take that library and point it to any website which says, I support OAuth, for the reasons that I just said. And if you wanted to more details, we can go in more details. But let's take a look at how this thing works. So let me copy some of these things which will come in useful. I want the application, resource, and let's make some order here. This one in the center, this one here. The new PowerPoint is fantastic. It does all these little things for aligning automatically. Before, doing the thing that I'm doing now was a terrible mess. Fantastic. Speaking well about PowerPoint, and of course, it breaks on you. Thank you, Office. All right. So how does OAuth work for this specific scenario, in which I have a native application running on a user device, which I will not keep here just for gaining a bit of space? How does this work? Let's take a look. So there is one entity which is called authorization server, which, if you are familiar with WS Federation, WS Trust, is the counterpart of the STS. How many of you guys are familiar with the term STS? Oh, fantastic. How many of you guys are familiar with the low-level working of OAuth? Oh, great. If the same amount of people would have said me, I would have skipped ahead and avoided boring you. But since so few of you did that, then I'm going to bore you. So there is this authorization server, and that's what is used by the rich client application to authenticate. And how does this work in details? There is one endpoint exposed by this authorization server, which is aptly called the authorization endpoint. And the way in which the application accesses it is that it pops out a browser in a way or another. If you are on a phone, it might redirect you to the browser app. If you are a rich client app, you might host a browser control. But anyway, what happens is that you have some way of displaying web content, and this thing lands on the authorization endpoint. Now, at this point, the authorization server does whatever it deems necessary to first recognize the current user, so that it can be established if the user is the owner of a resource that you are trying to access. And second, if necessary, it will display some UI for asking the user to grant consent. Let's say that the user will be asked, are you OK with that application to access that resource on your behalf? I know that on the client it's kind of weird. Let's say that when you do this on a website, it makes a lot of sense, because you are here in front of your machine, the website is somewhere else, and this website can access the resource even if you close the browser and you go home. This website now has your permission, and so it will keep calling. So it is a true delegation because the website is alive, is an agent, is active. However, in the case of rich client application, it's a bit more, how to say, blurry. That's to say that the application is kind of like one of those things that you use for grabbing stuff which is especially high, like fruits or similar. Like, yeah, it's not you grabbing the cherries in there, but it's your arm. Like, you are extending your arm somehow. So it's not really delegation or impersonation. However, in this new world of, how to say, sandboxed applications, application stores, and similar, those applications are downloaded by places that are like not necessarily fully trusted. Like, you trust the store, but you don't know exactly who built this app and similar, especially in non-business environment. So it is customarily that when you start the app declares the things it will do with your device, like I want to know your location, and I want to use your internet connection, and perhaps I will write in your document folder. And so you can think of this authorization as a part of some of those declarations. It just happens to be late binded. Let's say it doesn't happen when you start the app, it happens when you do the authentication. I know it's a bit subtle, but I think it's an important point. However, assuming that everything goes well, what happens is that our good friend gets back a code. Now, what is a code? And the browser goes. A code is just an opaque string. It can be whatever. The OAuth spec doesn't really specify what has to be. But the point is that now the application can redeem this code hitting another endpoint, the token endpoint. This time, this is an endpoint completely without a user interface. This is a purely programmatic call in which the client makes this call and includes the code. It includes its own ID. So that means that the authorization server must know in advance about the client. It will not give tokens to anybody. And sometimes you will add something in here for doing extra info. So we'll steal my own thunder and tell you already that that's how device registration in the new Active Directory works. What happens is that when you register your personal device, you get a certificate, which now is tied to your device, and your device is tied to your user. So once you do this leg of the protocol, this certificate comes along for the ride and is used for securing the channel. As a result, the authorization server or middleware, like the web proxy and similar, there are good sessions from the ADFS guys that explain everything in details, so that they can establish, yeah, this user obtained a code, is using an application that was registered through this ID, and it's coming from a registered device. So that's why we do this double step. However, again, if everything goes well, all right. Miracles provided by Bertocci Inc. Should we start the dancing? So if you're lucky, you get back an access token. Again, OAuth does not declare at all the shape of this token. This token could be completely opaque. This could be like a string, which refers to a row in some database somewhere. It could be any format. You could reuse SAML if you have pipes that are especially wide. But in general, in like a current practice, this thing is a JOT token, is a JWT, JSON Web Token. I'll go into details in a few slides. And then, in certain occasions, the token endpoint will also return another token, which is the refresh token. Now, what is the value of a refresh token? The access token is a token which is specifically, we say, scoped to the resource. It's a token that the resource expects in order to say, yes, the caller is actually, to say, obtained the necessary credentials for calling me. The refresh token is some kind of insurance. Like, you don't want to issue access tokens that last very long because that would be a big risk. You lose the device, you lose control of the device, who knows what happens? Or you fire the guy, and the guy still holds a token which holds power. Instead, the trick is to issue access tokens that are reasonably short-lived, and then issue a refresh token. Now, a refresh token is something which allows you, once the access token expires, to reach back to the authorization server and obtain a new access token without bothering the user with another prompt, which, if you guys ever designed applications of a client, you know it is of paramount importance. Like, every click is like one call of one guy complaining. And the advantage of this is that now the refresh token will allow you to do things like a revocation. Like, if your access token lasts 15 minutes, and within those 15 minutes, this guy reports his device stolen, now you can just turn on the crank, and then there will be no way, for like as soon as this guy comes back with a refresh token, they will not get back a new access token. And so at this point, like, you hedge your bets. And this is super important, especially in, in business contexts. And then, of course, what do you need at this point? You need some kind of cache for remembering those things. Because if you don't cache those tokens, then all these dance about access token, refresh token would have been for nothing. So you need something that helps you with deal with the life cycle. And also, if you don't have all your developers to have to learn all those details, you better have some way of wrapping this token lifecycle management in a way that makes it easy to use without knowing all the details. So that's one of the things that we need. But then, let's just look at the last leg of this. Now that we got our token and we are super happy, we can make our call, and OAuth tells us how. You can just get this thing and add it in HTTP header, and use a specific syntax, which you will see in a moment. And now, at the resource, you need something, which I will leave unnamed for the time being, some kind of middleware, which sits in front of your resource and has the necessary intelligence to look at this token and say, yes, this is the token that I wanted. And in our specific case, that means the ability of reading the token format that we are sending. In other platforms, this might be used in different ways. But in our case, we just do the same flow that we would normally use in other platforms, in, I'd say, older stacks. So that's OAuth. That's really not magic. For how many of you this was news? One. So when I asked, are you familiar with the inner workings of OAuth, you said No, we aren't. And now you already knew all this. I am confused. Is this some kind of quantic effect? All right, as long as I don't waste your time. So actually, before we go in here, let me give you a practical example of this. Let me just launch a little app which is already using the things that I'll show you in terms of products. But this app is more design, like it doesn't matter how it is implemented. It's just for showing you how this works. Like this is a little living sample in which you can see the client, which is the application which we are talking about, which in these specific cases, both that element and also the app that I'm running in itself. Then there is the authority, which represents the authorization server, which I was mentioning. And then there is the resource, which I want to invoke. And here, as you can see, I can, like this color code is designed to allow me to change any of these settings, and then my client will automatically generate a request for showing you how this works. And just for giving you a feeling of what that means at low level, this is the call that you would do to the authorization endpoint, in which you would hit the address of authorization endpoint, which in this case is a Windows Azure endpoint, specifically the Windows Azure Active Directory tenant of Trade Research, a classic example. Then you have the endpoint, which is OAuth, authorize. You might guess that the token one is OAuth token, in which I specify that the style of OAuth I want to use is this code, and then there are other styles which I will not touch on today. Then the resource that I want the token for is that specific localhost. Now, this is one thing that the OAuth spec does not have, and we had to add because we run a service for third parties. Like if you are, for example, Facebook, you are giving always tokens to yourself. Like when you use OAuth with Facebook, you get a token for calling the Facebook APIs. Instead, with Active Directory, you get a token for calling your own services. So we needed a way of telling to the authorization server, this is the resource I want, because it's not implicit, it's not obvious. So we added this parameter. And then we have a client ID, which I described. This is the client I'm using. And then the redirect URI is just a mechanism for saying, when you're done, go back to this URI. It does not even have to be a network URL. It can be just a logical representation. And as soon as my browser sees that URL, it will just jump on that. And now let's actually first clean the cache. And then let's see what happens if I take this message and I actually send it to my endpoint. Now, what you see here is the web authentication broker. How many of you guys know what is the web authentication broker? 1.5. OK. How many of you ever developed a Windows 8 store application? 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. So this talk kind of assumes that you know how to do it. I assure you it's not hard. I'm a server guy, and I did all this up. Took a couple of weekends, but I did it. And it was mostly because of the UI. Like if you want to do elaborate UI like this one, yes, that is my bar. For me, this one is elaborate UI. Then it will take some time. But in terms of like just doing the app, it's super easy. You go in Visual Studio and you say, new Windows Store app, and 70% of the work is already done. So here, in this session, I will only show you how to add authentication to it. And then if you are interested in the development, you can come over at the end, and I can point you to content for doing that. But anyway, the web authentication broker, and now probably it will time out because I blubbered for a long time, is a new API in the Windows Runtime API set, which allow you to pull out a canvas in which you can paint web content when you need to. In this specific case, we are using a very interesting trick. In order to drive authentication, we pop out a browser so that we get all the advantages of web sign-on, even if we are using an application. Now, since this is a very common pattern nowadays, Windows 8 added this feature in the runtime. And there are a number of interesting characteristics of these, like cookie segregation and similar, which I will not bore you with. But it's super easy. Like even if you would not be using our library, which make it even easier, it's very straightforward. It's just one API where you say, this is my URL, this is the return URL, show me this UI, and then at the end of it, it will call a callback and you retrieve the code. So very straightforward. So that's what you're seeing here. And this is our authorization server, our authorization endpoint, which is a rendering UI for me to do my authentication. And we'll see that this is a very flexible thing. Like now I'm using password, but in a short I'll use something way cooler. Let's see if I remember my password. So what happens is that now I didn't show it because this would be too crowded, but what happened is that I got back a code, and then I sent this code to the token endpoint, and there is what I got back. I got back information about when it expires. I got back a refresh token, which means that I was good. And then I have this access token, which is a JOT token. I will not go into the details for now. I will show what's inside this thing later. And then, if now I actually start also the service, this one is only the client. If I hit this thing, I will also start a resource so that I can actually request it. Yep, it's up. It's a classic MVC web API. How many of you ever used the web APIs? Great, fantastic. So I'll have good news for you in a short. So if I go back to my application, now I can just hit this call. And I was correctly authenticated because I included the token. And I got back just an empty collection because this call asks for a list of items, which I didn't add yet. I'll do it in a moment. But as you can see, I did all my authenticated calls. So that's how OAuth works. It is not especially hard. Now let's talk for a moment about Windows Azure Active Directory. How many of you ever used Windows Azure Active Directory? Not many. How many of you ever heard about Windows Azure Active Directory? Not in the last half an hour. I find it hilarious that somebody actually raised their hand after I said that. Fantastic. So Windows Azure Active Directory is a projection of your on-premises directory into a multi-tenant cloud-based service. And I realize that this sounds like marketing, but in short, you'll see that it is actually true. So let's consider for a moment your traditional directory. A directory typically is a store where you put users, groups, and other entities, which takes advantage of infrastructure such as credentials and ways of verifying authentication, offers endpoints, which I represent here with this A, for accessing the user store and authenticate users, and offers endpoints or otherwise means of managing the content of the store. So classic LDAP and similar. How many of you are familiar with LDAP? Great. I'm using these for making sure that you are still with me. I realize that it's kind of late in the day. How many of you come from different time zones? Yeah, I know. There's like 2 hours from Seattle. And last weekend, I was in Italy. One of my nephews got married, so I had to be the American uncle to go and do my duty. And I'm still jet-lagged, so I can understand if you guys are suffering a bit, for which I apologize. So Windows Azure Active Directory pretty much does the same things, but at cloud scale. So there is this service, which we call Direc. Let me represent it in our little picture, which takes selected parts of your directory and synchronizes them to the cloud. And so now we say that the Contosa has a tenant. And since here we are talking about a multi-tenant service, various things that normally on-premises are based on your instance, instead here are delivered in the same way for all the tenants. So specifically, I can take these arrows and put them outside to this, how to say, larger container. It's a bit like, I don't know, the plumbing that you get in an airport. Every shop in the lounge area of the airport will use the common services, electricity, internet, all kind of things, as opposed to one independent shop which has to do everything on its own outside of these managed areas. And of course, since here we are talking about something which is designed for the cloud, the way in which those two functions are performed is different. It is designed to actually support cloud workloads. Specifically, for the authentication, instead of offering the classic Kerberos, which would not work outside of your intranet, we offer a variety of different endpoints. We have a classic web sign-on, SAML-P, AWS Federation, and we have these two endpoints for OAuth, which we already got to know earlier. And the way in which an application talks with that is that, let me make this directory a bit bigger. If you have an application, these applications are tracked with what we call service principals. Those are principles which describe apps rather than users, and those can be used when you engage with those endpoints. Tomorrow, I will have a session about those endpoints. Today, I'm talking about those two. And then, for what concerns the management, normally on-prem, you would be using LDAP or similar. However, LDAP is not very well suited for a multi-tenant environment, and it's also not very well suited with a very decoupled, distributed, disconnected environment in which you might be running applications in the cloud in a completely different environment. And you really don't want to do things like hard coding credentials in that, like you would do with LDAP. Instead, what we use is OAuth. We eat our own dog food, like we like to say. And we have this API for which the gentleman in the back, Ed Vu, is the master and lord. Ed, when do you have your session? Tomorrow. If you want to know everything about the Graph API, go tomorrow at Ed's, and this is like the last moment that I will talk about it, because I'm afraid of saying something wrong and then Ed will do something bad to me. And that's for accessing programmatically the directory. And if instead you want to use the portal, then we have a portal which happens to be the Windows Azure portal. In fact, let me just quickly show that to you. Here I have a classic link to a Windows Azure portal. I just added a tenant because that's a business application of a directory. And then here I just sign in with my usual credentials, like my credentials of my enterprise. And then I'll get to my familiar Windows Azure store, where we GA'd 1 or 2 months ago. We recently added this new entry, Active Directory. And if I click on it, I can manage various aspects of my directory, pretty much like I would do with a classic MMC back home. So that's pretty much how the directory works at a high level, so that you have a feeling of how the service goes. Then, how do we use it specifically for this scenario? That is like a bit larger representation of my directory. I need to register both the client and the service application, the resource, so that the directory knows about them and enables the various workloads that put them together. But in fact, I need to do a bit more work. I need a further step for specifying that that specific client can access that specific resource and that can use a specific, what we call, scope. A scope is a way of representing the kind of access that the client can achieve on behalf of its user. And it is like a fairly common concept in OAuth. How many of you guys ever developed for Facebook? Okay. For everybody else, when you develop for Facebook and you get an access token for their APIs, what happens is that you specify what you want to do. Do you want to write to the wall? Do you want to see the list of friends? Do you want to get the email of a user? And those things are all part of a scope. Now, take the same concept and apply it in business environment. So that's pretty much the same. So largely what happens is that you end up creating an entry in what we call our permission table, which has a pointer to the client, a pointer to the representation of a server, and specifies the scope, which is classically a string. So from what concerns the various pieces that we need, that's it. Windows Azure Active Directory gives us one of the pieces that we need for doing the scenarios that we said we want. Now, we still have something missing. We have something missing here. How do I make my app easily communicate to the authorization server? If I know OAuth, I can do it by hand, but I assure you, many, many developers are not interested. OAuth is much easier than some of, but still is harder than nothing. Like when I want to wash my hands, I go to my faucet and I open it. And if I have like a Kevlar pipe or any other kind of pipe, I totally don't care. And here, security, to my chagrin, because that's my area, typically people like regard it as the broccoli in the dinner. You totally need it, but hey, I'm not looking forward for that. So in order for this to be viable, you need to have something in here. And the good news is that we do have it. We have what we call the Windows Azure Authentication Library. Now, how many of you guys went to the Udai's presentation? OK, great. So Udai used a slightly different name for this library. He used the Active Directory Authentication Library. Now, we called this library Azure Authentication Library because we could not say anything yet about the new capabilities of Windows Server. However, now that finally the cat is out of the bag, we will probably be renaming this library to something which reflects the fact that this works with Active Directory regardless if it is Windows Azure or on-premises. However, for the time being, since when you go and you download it, it's still called like this, I'm using this name, but just so you guys know. So you need something like that for obtaining tokens and for the token lifecycle, which again can be a real pain and can also be a security risk if you don't do it right. And then you need something at the resource level. This is a kind of middleware which listens to requests and validates it. And we also have this thing, and we call it the JOT handler. This is a piece of software, which I'll describe in a moment, which shows how to, that gives you the functionality of validating tokens. Now, just for giving you a feeling of this, I could, well, I can actually show you the process. Yes, let's do it. So there is, since we are still in preview for these capabilities, an app which we call the Graph Explorer, which is like a demo app that you can use for exploring the directory in a bit more, how to say, in an insider fashion. Like the portal shows you all the things that you would do for managing the directory, but if you want to develop against the directory, this thing gives you a bit more information. And let me sign in with the same user. OK, perfect. The other interesting thing that this application does is that I can register clients, services, and permissions that tie the two. So I can use this thing for basically performing the task that I described in the last slide. So let's do it. Let's say that here I want to create a new client, which I will call TechEd New Orleans. And here I just have to specify any URL. I'll actually do it. And now, thanks to this utility will create a new entry which uses exactly these coordinates. Now, I can specify also the service that I want to call. I could create a new one, but then I would have more work to do. So I'm going to just select one of my existing services, like this one. Perfect. And now, so once I will hit the create permission, the application will create the two entries in the directory, which represent clients that already exist, and then it will just tie them together. So let's do it. So I hit my create permission, and now what I got is the result here. The application created an entry for my client, and it specifies for which service this thing is competent for. Again, this is a preview. You will have a much more streamlined UI soon. And now, how do I use this? I can grab my client ID, go to my old client, and paste it here. And then I want also my application URL, which we put in here. And that's pretty much it. Like you will see in a moment that here I'm just doing it in the test client, but normally you'd paste it in code. But it's very, very straightforward. And at this point, I can just clean the cache just in case, do my request. And then here, I have the same experience as earlier. But now, not to make a good run of this to waste, I'd like to show you something which is a big advantage of using this approach based on a browser. Now, a classic problem that you'd have with rich clients is that the logic for doing authentication normally resides in the bits of a client. So say that for some reason you needed to lock down your system and heighten the security of a system. And now you want all your employees to use, I don't know, one-time passwords or any of those gizmo that high security people give to employees. Normally, like with a traditional approach, you'd have to take the logic which is necessary for gathering this new kind of credential, embed it in the client, and distribute the client everywhere. Good luck with that if you have a pretty significant investment. Now, if you use the browser, you totally don't have to do any of that stuff. Like in the browser, you can paint whatever you want. This is driven by a server. So like in the morning, you can use one technique. In the evening, another. Or you can use more than one technique at once, which is what I'm going to show here. Earlier, I signed in with a user, which, whatever. So I can just use a username and password. However, now I'm going to be Terry, which is a key component of my company. Also, I still don't know if Terry is a male or a female name. You guys tell me. How many think that Terry is a male name? 3, 4. How many thinks it's a female name? And everybody else is checked out. You just don't care. Okay, fantastic. It is good to know. Okay, so here, Terry is a user which is marked as like high in, I'd say, in critical. And so Terry, when it signs in, using web or, in this case, also using rich clients, Terry has to use a second authentication factor. So let's see what happens. Okay, and my second authentication factor is the phone. So I will keep it here, and once it will vibrate, you will probably jump on your seat. But we sent you a message to confirm. Let's hope that T-Mobile has a signal here. Come on, T-Mobile. Did you hear that? Zzz. I got an SMS which says, and I quote, your Microsoft verification code is 131423. Okay. So I reply with this code to continue, which is what I'm doing. Then I'll expense the SMS, of course. And now this thing will sense that I send the SMS and will let me through. And the interesting thing is that I didn't have to change any of my code for supporting this new technique. Like all my existing clients around are capable of taking advantage of this thing. And as you can see, ta-da, I got my token back. And I didn't have to do any specific effort. And as somebody who's been in this industry for a couple of decades, working with web services since the very start, I can tell you this is not huge, it's enormous. Like this is incredibly powerful. And in fact, many of our customers are interested in this specific aspect. Okay, so you saw like the setup. Now let's be a bit more specific and let's talk about the development, since I have just 26 minutes. Windows Azure Authentication Library. As I mentioned, the name will change, but for the time being, bear with me. This is a library which we designed for helping you to add authentication capabilities on clients. And in fact, I already lied. It is not one library. It's kind of like a franchise. Like there is many Starbucks, there are many AALs. And since this thing is designed to help you to work on a client, and since we have many interesting client platforms, we will have one AAL for each of those. Currently, we have one version for .NET, which can be used for classic desktop and for middle tiers. So if you're a website and you want to do this thing, you can use that library. And we have the version that I'm using today, which is the Windows Store version. It's a version which is specific to the Windows Store, and we'll see that it has interesting characteristics because of that. This library performs mostly two functions. One is the pure token acquisition. The other is the token lifecycle management, so that you don't have to worry about saving those tokens. You don't have to worry about refreshing those tokens. You don't have to worry about using the UI for popping out the interface and stopping the flow once you get to the return URL. All this stuff is taken care of by the library. But that's it. It does nothing else. So once you have a token, the way in which you use it for calling the service is completely up to you. We've been down that route with WCF, with creating proxies and similar, and it's kind of complicated. How many of you guys ever used the WCF? All right. So no channels. Like once you get a token, then it's up to you to make the call. And these, I would say, it's pretty natural. Like if you want to call a certain REST service, this service might have its own library. So how would you use a channel? So we just give you this thing that you can inject in there, and hopefully you can use it easily. This is not a protocol library. This is like super important. In WCF and in various other libraries, what we did was taking the protocols that we wanted to implement, and we projected them in the CLR, so that you would have objects and classes and methods which represent gestures and entities in the protocol. That works only if you assume that all of your audience is madly in love with learning security protocols. And I might be wrong, but I suspect that is absolutely not the case. Or at least, part of my career, I was an evangelist for this kind of stuff, and there is a pretty steep drop-off. Like there is a few people that absolutely want to do everything and know everything, and then there is everybody else which just want this thing to work. Remember, I open the faucet, I wash my hands. So what happens is that, yes, this library does use open protocols. And yes, you don't need to use the library. If you want to use the protocol, go ahead, be my guest. However, the library in itself does not expose to you the details of the protocol. It exposes the tasks that you want to perform. It gives you placeholders so that you tell us what you know about your scenario. This is my client ID. This is the resource I want to call. This is my tenant. And we make things happen. However, if you know the protocol, we try to use names which somehow resembles the one of the protocol, so that we don't really reinvent the wheel every time. This ships as a NuGet package. How many of you guys are familiar with NuGet? It was a little test, yes, for developers. And yeah, you can just go anytime and search for AIL, and you'll find it. On the Windows Store, this is more or less the structure. We chose to package the AIL Windows Store as a Windows runtime component. A Windows runtime component is a little piece of runtime magic, which projects functionalities to all the languages that are supported on Windows 8. So we wrote this library, and then we put this wrapper on top of it. We used the C#, but we exposed it using the WinRT types. As a result, if you wanted to take the library and use it from JavaScript, absolutely. You just use the specific syntax, the promises, which is offered by JavaScript, but the binary that you need to get is exactly the same. This is unique for Windows 8, of course. For .NET instead, it's a classic DLL. And it works pretty well. Here I just say C# and JS HTML5 because NuGet, at the time in which we released the preview, did not support C++ projects. But if you take the NuGet package, you pull out by hand the binary, and then you connect it to your C++ Windows 8 app, it should work. If it doesn't, you tell me, and I'll loop the right people in. And finally, this is how we use AIL. Here we have a very straightforward concept, which is what we call authentication context. Now, the authentication context represents these. Like, there is an authority somewhere in your scenario, and you know that this authority knows about your solution, knows about clients, knows about resource, has endpoints, has capabilities. So you need a way to approach that thing from your code, and that way is the authentication context. And you just pass to it the address of your tenant, This is important because from the address we understand that if you want to talk to a Windows Azure Active Directory tenant or an ADFS tenant or what we call Office tenants, which are tenants that have been created for, how to say, Office 365 some time ago. So for the developer, it's very straightforward. You just tell us who's the domain that has to look over everything. And then the next step is very, very straightforward. Here we have just a couple of overloads of this function, but we have this function called acquire token. In acquire token, I have to specify at the very minimum the identifier of a resource for which I need a token for, and the identifier of my client. And those two will be used in the way that I've shown with my little test application. They will be used in the context of that call for hitting the authorization endpoint, and then used similarly for the token endpoint. And these results in a token. Now, the interesting thing is you can always run those two things safely, because in the Windows Store case, the application context hits on a, static cache. It uses a cache which is common to the entire application. Then applications in Windows Store are sandboxed, so everything that gets saved in there cannot be accessed by other apps. So we could safely create an out-of-the-box cache. And then when you call this acquire token, we always go through that cache. So if you already have a token which fits the requirements, like from that client for that resource, we'll give it to you. If you have a token but is expired, but you have a refresh token, we'll use the refresh token on your behalf. And if successful, we'll give you the token. So I have an entire flowchart later, so I won't bore you now, but you get the point. You can safely take those two things and use them everywhere, and consistently, those will work without side effects. I say that because sometimes people are tempted to save the result somewhere and then use their own parts, which you can do if you want, but it's unnecessary. Like if you are okay with our default behavior of a cache, you don't need to do it. So it is the ultimate hands-off approach. And then below, there is just one example. I cannot know how you will use it. It will depend by the resource that you want. But this is a classic way in which you would call a service protected through OAuth. You would get the client, add a header with the access token that you get in there, with a bearer keyword, which declares this is going to be used as a bearer token, which means there is no key that I demonstrate usage for, and that's it. So those 4 lines of code are all you need. And if I manage to spend yet another weekend on this, if my wife doesn't get too upset, let's see if I can get to the app. I want to show off a little feature which I added on the plane, since it was 2 hours on the tarmac in Atlanta waiting for a storm to pass. So, okay, I'll develop. And here is this feature called generate code, in which I take all these settings that you see in here, and then I put in the clipboard just the code that you need for doing those calls. So you go in your test app, you play with that, you get this code once it works, and you paste it back into your real app, and you have your call. So super, super, super simple. Or at least that's the hope. So the cache. I don't want to bore you much with the details, but the idea here is that every cache entry has a composite key in which we know the authority, so the tenant, the ID of a client, the ID of a resource, and optionally, the user. You have seen in the test client here that they have this concept of login hint, and if I specify it, then when I go for calling, I get this field pre-filled, which sometimes is very useful because if you are a federated tenant, this thing will automatically redirect me to my local ADFS if necessary. So it reduces the chances of a user to get it wrong. And if you use it, we do use it in the cache so that we cache according to that specific user. And then, as I mentioned, this is what the cache does. Don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through this because this is just for your reference, just so if something weird happens, you say, what happened here? But again, this is one of those things of how does the processor decide to give to this process or this other process CPU time? Who cares? Normally, it just does it, and you take advantage of it. Can we do it at the end? Thank you. OK, let's talk very quickly about JSON Web Tokens. JSON Web Tokens are JSON-based lightweight tokens, which are just perfect for REST workloads because they are teeny. They are really small, and they are based on JSON, which is supported pretty much across the board. You'd be hard-pressed to find a platform or a development stack which does not support JSON, so that's great. And the good news is that this is one of the cornerstones of OpenID Connect, which unfortunately I don't have time to detail, but let's just say that OpenID Connect is the correct way of layering sign-on top of OAuth. And OpenID Connect avoids some of the mistakes that, I'm sorry, here I'm projecting my own opinion, so I take it back. Some of the things which created all these interoperability issues when using OAuth, like it is specifying the token format, so that there is no leeway, there is no ambiguity. So if I know that A and B both support OpenID Connect, yes, I can assume they can talk to each other. So it's a great advancement, and of course, it's being used by many other companies, many of them competitors, hence it's a bad idea for me to repeat them, especially with the press in the room, even if they're doing their email. They're not reacting. But you can just do a quick search. JWT is used across the board. It's super common. And so what did we do? In .NET 4.5, we have a set of classes which are designed for doing specifically token processing. Like we created these for web single sign-on, all these kind of things. And we have a generic framework that you can use for taking advantage of these kind of things. So we just used the same framework to create another component which just neatly fits in the existing pipelines for understanding this new format, which is now, or is soon be once we hit RTM, a first-class citizen in .NET 4.5. So it is another NuGet package, and it's very easy to use. It's very easy to use also outside of the pipeline. Since here we are talking about very lightweight scenarios in which you just have your web API, the code for taking advantage of it is very, very straightforward. Let me just give you a taste of that. Here I am looking at the global ASACs of my web API. And all I need is pretty much these few lines. I need to create a new instance of my handler. I need to pass to it what are the parameters which define a good token. It has to come from this issuer, which is Trey Research in this case. It has to be scoped to this address, which is my URI, which represents my resource in the system. And it has to be signed with this token, which, by the way, is, something which you can acquire dynamically. And we do have in our samples automatic refresh of these keys. And then you just call validate token. And if it is successful, you get back a representation of identity in .NET, a claims principle. So again, super easy to use, does not require any of the pipeline that you would normally have to deal with WIF. And now I think that I'll skip some of these details because I want to absolutely talk about on-premises because it's the big news. Now, ADFS 2.0, fantastic product, used across the board, key for the success of Office 365, which has been super, super successful. In Windows Server R2, Windows Server 2012 R2, it moves to the next level. And all the capabilities that we had before are augmented by these new OAuth endpoints, which are pretty much mirroring what happened in the Windows Azure Active Directory, which being a service, of course, is more agile and can go faster. But in the end, we want to go in the same place from both areas. And it supports the same flow that I described, supports clients that are native apps as opposed to, the website. It has, all the configuration that you might think of, and it has a penchant for integrating with things like the device registration, and all these kind of like management-oriented tasks, which you would expect from Active Directory. So for example, it ties giving you a token or a refresh token to the fact that you are calling from a device which is registered. If you're not registered, it does not give you a refresh token, and you might have policies in which it might not give you a token at all if you don't want to give access in certain situations. And yep, pretty much what I just said. Also, it has its own brand of multi-authentication factor, which, again, I encourage you to go to the ADFS sessions because it's very important. And here, I just wanted to give you a feeling of how this works for the registration. Like, unfortunately, I can't show you the UI yet because. But here, at a high level, that's how it works. The idea is that you can take your device, and how many of you guys saw the keynote? Pretty much everybody. Great. So you have actually seen this happening. You have seen a user with its own device going in the network properties and register the device, like saying workplace join. And in practice, what did that mean? Basically, it means that you'll create one entry in your local directory specifically for that device and that user. And then there is a proxy somewhere which will be, how to say, in charge of verifying that the calls always attach this certificate, which gets dropped on the device, which is done by Intune, so that it can verify that not only that call is coming from that user, but is also coming from that user from that device. And yep, there are various other interesting management features, which I will not butcher by describing them, because there are more qualified people that have sessions specifically for talking about that. What instead I'm going to do is demonstrate, if the internet collaborates, that it's actually straightforward to take the exact same application, just specify in AIL different parameters, the parameters which instead of pointing to the Windows Azure directory, they point to your local directory, and everything will just work out of the box. So as you can see here, in the authority currently, I have this login windows.net/the tenant. So I'm clearly going in Windows Azure. Now here I added this little feature in which I don't have to type. I can select a new set of settings. And here now you can see that the URL goes to this stscontoso100.com, which is a VM which is running somewhere, which I know nothing about. I went to the ADFS guys and I said, guys, can you provision a client and a resource for me so that I can show how this works? And they did that, which kind of like modeled what would happen in real life when a developer would go on his knees, putting like little stones to make the experience more exciting, and pray the administrator to please, can you provision this thing for me? But luckily, the ADFS guys like me, or at least they pretended to like me, so I didn't have to humiliate myself. So now, unfortunately, the network here didn't always collaborate, but here, hopefully, this will work. And it worked. So now, as you can see, the UI here is different because it's being served by a Windows Server 2012 R2 machine. And here I can give my credentials. Let's see if I change the credentials just for making my demo more interesting. And instead, it worked. And now, as you can see, I did not get a refresh token. I did not get a refresh token because I'm using a good old Windows 8 device, which does not have the capability of workplace join. Hence, I'm actually lucky that I got a token to begin with, because there are ways in which we can just say, nope, this resource is available only to client coming from registered devices. So that's pretty straightforward. And this has been a feature that people have been asking almost on like every 2 days. And every time I had to be evasive and say, oh, I can't say anything. And now finally. So please, if your colleagues ask something about it, help me spread the word. Now, Active Directory will be capable of dealing with rich clients as well, which in my opinion is super cool. Okay, so We still have 5 minutes, but I'm sure that you guys have questions, so I don't want to go back and stretch further. We talked about what are the things which prevent us from using the old approaches to reach clients in this new world. This new world, our resource might live outside of our organization. It might live in the cloud, or it might live anywhere else. It doesn't matter. It's out of the reach of your domain controller if you use Kerberos. Your directory in itself might be in the cloud, as it is the case for many applications. And the application itself might be running on a device of which you do not have a full control, and a device that might not have the capability of actually using the traditional flows. As a result, we can take advantage of these new protocols, which were born for the web, so for a different flow, but that, like salmons coming up from a consumerization of IT, brought us back things that now are possible also in enterprise context, such as, for example, enlisting a browser surface for performing your authentication flows. And my hope is that today you have the chance of seeing that if you want to build applications that are based on this, if you want to write rich clients which take advantage of your existing Active Directory investment, and if you want to target the cloud with your app, do all those, how to say, modern things, you have all the tools that you need. You have a capability in Active Directory on premises. You have those capabilities in our service offering, and you have all the developer libraries, both for the resource and for the client side, for making all these together. So what are you still doing here? Shouldn't you be writing applications? Thank you. As I mentioned, we have various other sessions. One of them today, like a secure anywhere access to corporate resources, I believe is from Sam, is from the DFS guys, and I strongly encourage you to go there because they'll go far in more details than I did, since I wanted to keep this for developers. That said, we have 3 minutes for questions, and then if we exceed the time, we can just, how to say, gather and leave the room, but I'm happy to stay as long as you want. Yes, sir. Sliding tokens. The question is sliding sessions a good place for, like a good use of a refresh token? And the answer is, yeah. Let's say that as long as you are happy with the way in which the service performs the refresh, then yes, absolutely. Otherwise, that's exactly a good description of how it works. Like if you go beyond your validation, then it goes down, of course. Yep. Yes, sir.
So is it possible now for a federated user to, who tries to log into a Windows 8 application which uses AAL authentication?
The question is it possible now for a federated user to use AAL for authenticate itself? And the answer is yes, if the federated user comes from a registered Windows Azure Active Directory tenant. So if you have your tenant in Windows Azure Active Directory and your tenant is backed by your on-prem directory, then yeah, absolutely, it will work. Like as soon as you type your user in that first thing and you hit tab, the system will know that your domain is federated and will redirect you on premises. Great. Yes, sir. The question is, I want my user to, since they are already logged in, to be logged in without having to type their password again. And the answer is, if they are already authenticated, and if they are sitting in front of their workstation, and if their workstation is joined to the domain, and if they are signed in with their domain user, then they don't have to. As soon as the system figures out that you are a user of that specific domain, in whatever way you want. You can specify it, user can type. You'll be redirected to the ADFS endpoint. And once you have the ADFS endpoint, if you're already authenticated, you are going to get back a token without being prompted. And then this token will just percolate and you'll be in. Now, the web authentication broker provides a silent mode in which if you don't use AAL, you just use directly the WAB, what we call the WAB, then you can actually say, try to do this without showing the UI. And in that case, you would see absolutely nothing. However, there is a 10 seconds timeout in which if you are trying your luck, but the user, I don't know, is at home, so doesn't really have access to this thing, now you have to wait 10 seconds before failing. And usability-wise, 10 seconds is like an ocean. So in this release, we chose not to use that thing. However, we know that there are a number of situations in which even that initial thing might be not very, how to say, pleasant. And so we are thinking of ways of mitigating or eliminating the issue altogether. All right. Yes, sir. The question is, can non-Windows devices use the library? And the answer is, not yet, like Batman. Not yet, as in, we have in our roadmap to cover all the relevant clients. And we are, how to say, working our way through the list. We started with .NET because it's like the most spread. Then next we added Windows Store, and then the other platforms, if they are popular, we are going to do it. All right. Anybody else? Yes, sir. The question is there anything that you have shown that you can use up today? And the answer is absolutely. Apart from the Windows Server aspects, which I believe you'll have to wait until build to see then, to actually get your hands on the bits, then both HWT and the AAL.NET and WinRT are absolutely available. You go in NuGet, actually go in Visual Studio, add the package reference, and you find them. And we have walkthroughs, we have samples, and we'll have all the links in the deck. And now I am at negative 2 minutes, so I have to wrap. Thank you guys for staying until the last moment. Thank you.